Here's our interview with Catherine Austin Fitts, the former Assistant Secretary of Housing under George Herbert Walker Bush. To say the information that she covers in this interview is vital is putting it lightly.
My name is Catherine Austin Fitts. I am originally from Philadelphia. I went to university and business school and then to Wall Street in 1978, and eventually became a partner and member of the board of an investment bank called Dillon Read & Company, and left in 1989 to join the Bush administration as Assistant Secretary of Housing, Federal Housing Commissioner, and then left after 18 months to start my own company, Hamilton Securities, which was both an investment bank and software developer in Washington. And the company was very successful and became, unfortunately, embroiled in very serious litigation with the federal government. And it was through that process that I was forced to research and try and understand the corruption that was really taking over on Wall Street in Washington. And I then settled the litigation, and in the process, many people had come to me saying, how do I protect my own assets from the corruption? And so I started an investment advisory company and moved to a small farming community, Hickory Valley, Tennessee, where I live now. I really felt Washington was centralizing political and economic power, and I thought entrepreneurs have to take this wonderful new technology of the internet and use it to decentralize. You know, and America breaks down to 3,100 counties, and so my feeling was 3,100 counties have to decentralize and bring the economic power back to the economies. And another way to think about it is, if you study how the human body works, in a crisis, we will preserve the blood for the heart and the lungs and the brains and draw it from the toes. And if you look at our current economy, we're sending the blood to the toes and the fingers and pulling it from the heart, the lungs, and the brain, the real economy. And I really thought technology could help you reverse it. And in fact, it appeared to be working. It was very successful, which is, I think, why we ended up being the target. And you see that happen a lot to the companies that were using software to decentralize. They would get targeted, and this, you know, the government steal the software and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, this tension of, are we going to decentralize in a way that's that creates wealth, or are we going to centralize in a way that destroys wealth, is really the battle that's going on globally and as part of what's been happening in America. One of the things to understand is that if you look at a household budget, or a family's financial cash flow, so if you look at our 401ks, if you look at our IRAs, our bank deposits, or other savings and investments, the taxes we pay, the money we waste on lottery, we're all shipping our money into Washington and Wall Street, and then it's trickling back, okay? It's almost like, you know, if you think of an irrigation system, we're sending our water down the river, it's hitting a dam, and it's not really coming back, but we have the power to shift the flows. And I was sitting, one of the ways I realized it, I was sitting with 3 women here in Tennessee. And one of them, I always get people to talk about their money. So one of them said that she had her retirement savings in the local bank, and their correspondent bank is a large New York bank, over, approximately 1,000 miles away. And so she's earning about 3%. Let's say the bank's paying 4% to get that money. And then the second woman has an IRA, and she had stock in the same New York bank. And this was before 2008, because in 2008 she would have lost most of her money. But she figured she's getting about 5% for that equity investment. So figure that bank's paying 4 to 5% to get the capital of these 2 women. So they're sending their money to New York and getting back about 4 to 5%. The third woman had started a business with a credit card from that same New York bank, and after she had borrowed the money, they had jacked up the interest rate to 23%. So these women are sending their capital and getting about 4%, and one of their best friends is borrowing it back at 23%. Now, that is, you call that on Wall Street a 2,000 basis point arbitrage. That's a huge spread. And when you look at the cash flows, there's no reason why those women, alone, or those women with a local bank or local financial institution can't circulate that money in a way that's going to make them all much more money. So no one needs a bank over 1,000 miles away in between three friends with those cash flows. But that's what's happening, and it's happening all across the economy. They can lend to each other, or if they don't want to lend to each other, there's services now where literally you can go to a company that will just service the loan and write up the documents and service things among people who are family or friends. So that's one way you can do it. But you can also go to a local community bank and say, you know, we're not in the lending business and we don't want to become financially knowledgeable about all this. Will you make a loan? One of us has CDs. We'll post our CDs as collateral. This third person will write a contract to the first saying, I'll guarantee it because you don't want to take the risk. And then the third person, you know, the third person will borrow. You do it all with a community bank. The community bank takes a spread that is a lot less than 2,000 basis points and say, you know, the borrower could pay 12%. Okay, so these two, instead of making 4%, let's say they make 8%, the bank makes 4%, and everybody's happy except the New York, you know, the big New York bank. But then you keep the money locally. And you can go through our economy and you'll see the same thing happen. I just described a loan, but I can show you the same thing with equity investments. I mean, how many people said that Enron was a better investment than Hickory Valley Meat Market? I beg to differ. I still have the Hickory Valley Meat Market. You know, they don't have their money from Enron. So if you go through the household budgets and cash flows in every community, and you start looking to see, how can I take the blood out of the toes and engineer it back into the heart and lungs in a way that makes me money, those opportunities are abundant, particularly if enough of us start to see them and do them. I was lying on the table at a natural practitioner's office, and she was explaining to me how a tapeworm works in your body. What a tapeworm does, it injects into you a chemical that makes you crave what's good for the tapeworm. So, you know, you are the one who feeds yourself whatever it is the tapeworm wants. And so you go through this process where you feed the tapeworm and the tapeworm grows stronger and stronger and stronger, and you grow weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's a very beautiful description of sort of our relationship with you know, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex and the financial sector, which has grown like a big fat tapeworm over the last, particularly the last 15 years. But anyway, so I was listening to her and I said, you know, I need to use that phrase. So I started to talk about the tapeworm economy. Because if you look at the tapeworm economy, the media feeds us information about what's good for the tapeworm and bad for us. So, you know, we watch TV or we listen to the TV news, and we're encouraged to do things that make money for big corporations, but in ways that reduce either our physical equity or our financial equity. So they get richer and we get poorer. And so we have this dynamic where we're the host and we're feeding the tapeworm. And the more we feed the tapeworm, the more powerful it gets and the more we lose. So if you go back to the 3 women in Tennessee, they're getting poorer and poorer because they're making less on their investments or they're paying more for what they're borrowing. And meantime, the tapeworm in the middle is getting richer and richer and richer. So a tapeworm economy is an economy where a few insiders can constantly drain subsidy from the outsiders in a way that preserves their wealth, but it shrinks total wealth because the host is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Since the beginning of the Republic, so from the Revolutionary War till about 18 months to 2 years ago, if you look at all the debt we'd issued to finance everything, so finance the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all the infrastructures, the building of the highways, all the bridges, the space program, all that, all the government programs, the GI Bill. So you look at all the debt we've issued to finance everything since the beginning of the Republic, that amount of money was $12 trillion. And then in 18 months, we gave or lent from the Treasury and the central bank an equivalent amount, another $12 trillion to the banks. Now, what was that about? That $12 trillion refinanced out literally $12 trillion of paper, toxic paper, and derivatives that the financial sector issued during the 1990s, the last 15 years, literally to finance a leveraged buyout of the country and the planet. So think of it this way. I want to take you over. I issue everybody else $12 trillion of funny money. I take you over, and then I use your $12 trillion to pay them back. Okay? So literally, we're watching a leveraged buyout of a country, and that's why I call it a financial coup d'etat. And that's what the bailouts were. One of the things that caused this tremendous ballooning of the power and economic resources of the financial sector was in the early 90s, we passed the Uruguay round for GATT, for the General Agreement on Tariffs, Trade and Tariffs. As a result, we changed the rules of how capital can flow around the world. And so suddenly, it's sort of Ross Perot's giant sucking sound. You pull tremendous amounts of capital out of this country, and you shift them abroad into other areas around the world. And one of the things, in fact, that happened, we do a lot to pull liquidity on those other areas so that you can buy in cheap. So you pump up the United States economy at the same time you flatten the economy in Asia or in Latin America so you can buy in, so you take this money at a high price and buy in cheap at a low price. Okay, so they're shifting massive amounts of capital, and as they shift that capital, they totally change who's the owner. Okay, so when it leaves this country, $5 trillion of that money is in the United States government, so it's shared, it's in the commons, if you will. By the time it gets to Asia, the ownership is in the hands of small numbers of people. So you see this enormous capital shift. And one of the other things that happens as that capital shift occurs is we're watching the end of sovereign governments and the rise of corporations. We're literally changing the governance structure on planet Earth so that we're no longer governed by countries that coordinate with each other. We're literally governed by private corporations. In this process, and part of it is privatization, you're watching liabilities being shifted into sovereign governments and assets being shifted to corporations. Okay? So the corporations are getting the assets and the governments are getting the liabilities. So let's go back to the bailout. One of the ways to look at this is when we did that capital shift, we said in the beginning of the 90s, we can't afford the retirement of the boomers. We've promised them in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid more than we can afford to pay. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull all their retirement savings out. We're going to basically shift out all the money that's in the pension funds, the equivalent, okay? And what we're going to put back in their pension funds is phony baloney paper. And we're going to shift out the money that's in the Social Security fund and shift in phony baloney paper. So that once we've gotten all the money out, they're going to be sitting with a bunch of phony baloney paper and promises to each other. Okay? So it's really a way of leaving the American middle class high and dry and getting out while the getting is good. In the 90s, there were a group of people in Washington who, clearly seeing what was going to happen with globalization, said, look, we're going to transfer all the jobs abroad, and we're going to transfer huge amounts of capital abroad. And what that means is we need Americans to change. We need to help the broad middle class and the citizenry adapt to these changes. And that means we need to pay down our debt, and we need to flow equity capital back into small business, because small business is what is creating the jobs. And we need to integrate new technology into small business and into communities. So I had started the software developer Hamilton Securities Group. What we were doing was we were making a software tool called Community Wizard that would let people see where all the government money was within their county or their community. And part of that was to do these things, you needed to re-engineer and make government investment much, much more productive. There's tremendous waste, still is. And you really needed small business to be an engine with government of job creation in a way that would produce a lot of financial wealth. Because that's what the boomers needed for retirement. They needed They needed the pension funds to really be sufficiently funded. Okay, so there's a whole group of people interested in making this all possible. And so while the money would flow out and manufacturing and jobs would flow to Asia, there would be something new lifting up. Okay, so all of this was known. I don't know if you remember Newt Gingrich running around and saying every kid needed a laptop. Well, that's what he was talking about. He was talking about integrating new technology and helping revive new skills. Okay, so we knew all this was going to happen, and we knew that we needed a plan to deal with it. Okay, so I was part of a group of people saying, pay down your debt, flow equity, small business, create new skills, new jobs, because otherwise the American middle class is toast. Well, you know, sort of the litigation that we dealt with was the response. The federal government said, no, we want you guys to leave town, and we're going to force you out with dirty tricks. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to have a bubble. We're going to have a housing bubble and get everybody, instead of building new skills, to run around and just build bigger houses. So we're going to build much bigger houses, and while everybody's building bigger houses and watching TV, we're going to quietly move all the money out of the country. And then when it's all said and done, you know, it'll be too late, because they'll have, instead of less debt, more debt. They'll have fewer small businesses, because we're going to have our big franchises and corporations come in and take over the local market. And, you know, so we'll have a party and no one will notice. And then by the time they notice, it'll be too late. And so what happened was the average American family was encouraged to take on mortgage debt, auto debt, credit card debt that in many respects they did not know that they couldn't afford. Now, what was amazing was the government and the financial institutions knew they couldn't afford it. In other words, they encouraged them to take on this debt, knowing that the policies were being engineered that would cause their incomes to fall later on. So, for example, let's just say you're a man with a family and 2 kids, and you have a job as a software developer, and you feel like you're doing very well. You don't know that a whole series of things are going on behind the scenes that mean you're going to lose your job in 3 to 5 years. I mean, it's statistically very probable, okay? So you don't know that, but the financial institution that's making you the loan does know that, okay? So they come to you and you say, well, you know what, the housing prices in Austin, Texas are rising, and I'm doing well, and my family's growing, and I need a bigger, it's a perfectly reasonable thing. And that's a strategy that's always worked for Americans with very rare exception. So that's the responsible thing for you to do. And I say, oh yeah, no, I'm encouraging you to do that. And in fact, you don't need to make a down payment, and I'll encourage you to, so I encourage you to do the mortgage, and you take out the mortgage, you buy the house. Now, under the law, I'm not an attorney, but my understanding of the law is, if I know something about your financial situation that you don't, and I don't disclose that, that's a material omission. So if I don't say to you, Mr. Smith, you keep your savings in this bank, and we're using your savings to loan money to JP Morgan Chase to move all these jobs abroad. In fact, all the jobs for your food stamp government contract, we're moving to India. So you as a taxpayer are going to fund these jobs. Your deposits are moving these jobs. And when we get these jobs all moved in another 3 to 5 years, you'll probably lose your job. Okay? We don't tell you any of that. We just say, here's more debt. Now, under the law, I believe that there's a case to be made that that's fraudulent inducement. Fraudulent inducement is if I encourage you to take on debt and fail to disclose something that I know that you don't. That's a material omission under the law. It's illegal. Okay? Now, if that's the case, just speaking as the former Assistant Secretary of Housing, the vast majority of mortgages originated in the United States after 1996 were fraudulently induced. Now, we can all say that. Even, let's say the Supreme Court decides tomorrow they're all fraudulently induced. The reality is our pension funds own them. So we just sold our fraudulently induced mortgages into the pension funds, and if we can't pay off those mortgages, then guess what happens to our retirement savings? In the summer of 2000, I was giving a speech to a group of people called Spiritual Frontiers Foundation International. And they have a conference once a year to discuss how they as a group can help our society evolve spiritually. They're very well educated, very wonderful, very committed people. So I'm in the middle of the speech, and a friend of mine had asked me to give a speech on, it's called How the Money Works on Organized Crime. And it later became an article called Narco Dollars for Dummies. And so I'm in the middle of the speech, and I'm describing the fact that the Department of Justice a year before had told a reporter that I work with that the U.S. economy launders $500 billion to $1 trillion of all dirty money. So that's narcotics trafficking, that's tax evasion, that's financial fraud. With financial fraud, it's much bigger now. So I said to this wonderful audience of spiritually evolved people, what would happen if we stopped? And there's a little sort of conversation, and they said, well, you know, our mutual funds would go down because that $500 billion to $1 trillion wouldn't come into the stock market, you know, go to London or Zurich or Hong Kong. And we'd have trouble financing the government deficit because we need to borrow all this money to finance. So our taxes might go up or our government checks might stop. And I said, okay, well, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern. And if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your city, your county, your state, your country tomorrow, thus offending the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of money laundering through the U.S. financial system and the accumulated reinvested capital thereon over the last umpteen years. Who here will push the button? And out of 100 people dedicated to evolving our society spiritually, guess how many would push the button? 1. So I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our government checks to stop, we don't want our taxes to go up, and we don't want our mutual funds to go down. So that's the conundrum. Because if you look at the American financial system, we have created through force, you know, it's called the central banking warfare model. The central bank prints paper, and then the military makes sure that everybody takes it while they're extracting the natural resources for cheap, right? Okay, so the tapeworm economy is not just in America. The tapeworm is extracting a subsidy all around the world. And until 2008, most Americans were the beneficiary of that. Now, you can say most Americans were naive. If you look at every county in America, one of the biggest businesses in every county is narcotics trafficking. Illegal drugs targeted at the children that makes everyone money. Okay? And then the government has huge war on drugs, and that makes a lot of other people money. So one of the biggest industries in America is the genocide of the children of our neighbors. That puts us as a people across the line because we've been complicit. I spent a decade trying to warn my family, my friends. You know, I ended up on Alex Jones and all sorts of radio shows explaining. I was the former Assistant Secretary of Housing. I was a former partner of a Wall Street firm. And yet the majority of people who heard me wouldn't believe me and wouldn't listen. So we've all gone along, we've all been complicit, we've all one way or another been the beneficiary. And, you know, and it's hard, it's hard to face what has to be faced. I used to have a pastor in Washington who would say, if we can face it, God can fix it. And what came out that day that I told the story about the story of the group I was speaking to was what they didn't understand is if they would just look at it, if they would just look at the red button problem and talk about it, that there was a way to turn the red button green. In other words, the question we need to ask is not should we push the red button, but how do we make money pushing it? So I call it turning it green. Because there are. The tapeworm economy is draining us. And so the issue is how do we reverse that drain? How do we start to get energy for us instead of giving energy to the tapeworm? And so part of it is delinking it from this global taxation system that's going on that we all think we've been the beneficiaries of. Because the day of the insider sharing the subsidy with us is diminishing. We've been gutting our whole economy for decades. I mean, we've been moving manufacturing capacity abroad, you know, significantly since the since the 80s. So this has been going on for 25 years, and it's continuing. And, you know, there's a myth that we're moving it abroad because it's more efficient, and that's not always true. A lot of times we're moving it abroad because we can change who owns it and who controls it by moving it. So, you know, it's churning and it's pumping and dumping in a way that doesn't make the economy wealthier. But there's no doubt that the whole GATT process is one that is to me terrifying. And I'll tell you where the greatest danger lies. The greatest danger lies not in the wiping out of the American middle class or the re-engineering of jobs and how they work, or even the transference of power from sovereign governments to corporations. The most dangerous part of GATT is the creation of a corporate right to create patents on life. So to create terminator seed and control the seed and food supply. What GATT is doing, particularly if this new round, the Doha round, goes into implementation, is basically shifting 2 to 3 billion people off the land as small farmers and either killing them or into the cities in a process that will ultimately control the seed and food supply, as that seed and food supply is being genetically manipulated. And when you take 50% of a planetary population and move it from something where it's eating healthy food on a self-sufficient basis into a dependent role where it's dependent on corporations for food that is not healthy, then you're talking about a kind of planetary slavery, which is more horrible than anything we've ever envisioned. Now, one of my questions is control, you know, to control, to build a global financial system around a dollar, in which the dollar is hugely subsidized by this sort of global taxation system. I mean, to give you an example, you know, you're the Chinese, I'm the Americans, I sell you dollars way above market level, and you take them and hold them while they go down 5% every year. That's a taxation system through the balance sheet, okay? So one of the ways I do this is not only by having a military, but by controlling oil, okay? So controlling a very important physical asset is almost essential to having currency control. And